Welcome to the Talk BD podcast, where we break down the science and strategies to live well with bipolar disorder.
General Greg Martin, I have the treat of getting to call you Martino now, which is your friends and family name. We got to meet in person at the International Society for Bipolar Disorders conference, and I think we became friends at that conference. Do you think so?
Absolutely. I mean, I felt like a friend before, but then when we met in person and got to hang out for 4 days, then the friendship really got solid. So I'm very thankful for that.
So I feel the same way. I'm really excited today to have another conversation with you about, the big picture of your story and your journey. And let me start with some questions. So when did you know you wanted to join the army? Was that sort of, something you grew up with as a kid? How did you get to that point?
So I had a lot of military service in my family, my dad, uncles, and so forth. And I always thought going in the Coast Guard or the Navy, being at sea in ships would be really cool. But when it came time to actually join, the only military academy that accepted me was West Point, which is the Army. And so when I got accepted, it was just such a good package with great education, great people, sports, leadership, and then, no cost because you get a full scholarship. I said, okay, I got into West Point, I'm going. And that was it. And I thought I would only serve my minimal time, which was 5 years. But I got out in the Army and I just fell in love with the soldiers. They were just so great to work with. And the mission was exciting and important. And so all of that together just kept me in for what ended up being over 30 years.
How old were you when you went to West Point, when you joined?
I was 18.
18. And then you had your sort of 5-year commitment. And then tell me, I know there's not an average day in Army life, but thinking back to kind of your early 20s, what did life look for you? How did it look for you at that point?
So a typical day, you were either in garrison, at the base where you would be doing training, maintenance of equipment, supply accountability. And a lot of what I ended up doing as a young officer lieutenant was really kind of personnel or social work for my soldiers. A lot of the soldiers had personal problems, like they didn't get their promotion on time. They weren't getting their pay. They had medical problems that weren't getting taken care of because of the bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And so I would spend an enormous amount of my time helping each of the soldiers who had problems, getting their problems fixed. Because as a lieutenant, you're not that high ranking, but you're a lot higher than the enlisted guys. And I could go into the headquarters and say, hey, I'm really trying to take care of Private so-and-so or Sergeant so-and-so. Can you help me? So that would be when you're in garrison. And I lived in a German town, and I would run 4 miles each way to work. So I'd run 4 miles from the German farm into the base, work all day. And then at lunchtime, I'd lift weights, play basketball, work all the rest of the day, and then run home at night. And I would do farm chores, and I would work in a German guest house or a restaurant. So that was a pretty typical day in garrison. But then we probably spent half our time or 2/3 of our time out what we call in the field. So we would deploy out with all of our equipment and all of our gear, and we'd go live out in the field, in the woods, at a big training area, doing live fire exercises, maneuvers. As an engineer unit, we also did lots of construction projects for the Army, the Air Force, and the German civilian population. And so when you're out in the field, you're really, really busy. You're going about 7 days a week. You're sleeping in, tents if you're lucky. And, there's a lot of activity in the training area where you've got tanks firing and, guns going off and artillery going off and airplanes coming in and dropping bombs nearby. So it's pretty exciting.
It sounds pretty varied. It sounds like, first of all, there was a lot of sort of, people management and support you were doing, and that you had pretty good social skills by the sound of it at that point. And also that you had plenty of energy to get through, a lot of exercise, a lot of training. your army job, but then farm chores on top of that. How was your mood during that period of your life overall?
So very positive. I've since learned in the last couple of years through research and dealing with different psychiatrists that I had a hyperthymic mood or a hyperthymic personality type, which is where it's a near continuous level of low-level mania. So again, giving me those qualities of, energy, enthusiasm, drive, et cetera, but not going so high as to be, real mania or to be dangerous or to be destructive. Just, it really was a performance boost, a performance enhancement. And that hyperthymia kept inching upwards for years and even decades until I went on the bipolar spectrum. I was probably at probably by the time I was in my early 40s, I was at kind of a sub-bipolar spectrum. And then in Iraq at 47, I just went into real bipolar disorder. So I would say I was extremely happy, energetic, positive. I never had a bad day. I had zero depression. I didn't need much sleep. I worked really hard, but I enjoyed the work. I loved being around the soldiers. I loved speaking German and meeting all the German people and going out and, eating German food and living in the culture. So, I just really had a wonderful time.
And you were functioning very well by the sound of it until the point of Iraq. Was that where things really started to kind of go a bit awry for you?
So Iraq is when my onset of bipolar disorder was. But I was really fortunate that it was really kind of a high performing mania that mostly enhanced and boosted my performance, but it was interspersed with little dips of depression. And in the depression, I would be indecisive, withdrawn. It was a kind of a downer, but they would only last maybe hours or a day or two. And then I started having psychosis and started having paranoid delusions about some of the people who worked for me. So the Iraq early mania was kind of a mixed bag, but it mostly helped me. And then over the next 12 years, my mania started getting higher, my depression lower, and that's when the problems started to occur. I started getting more and more out of control, poor judgment, erratic behavior. My decision-making became suspect. I became more paranoid, started having more delusions. And then that just went out of control by 2014. So about 12 years into my bipolar disorder, I was off the rails, full-blown mania, got fired, had to retire, was hospitalized.
So a long build up there, but let's go back a little bit in time, because it sounds to me like you were saying that there were some hints of psychotic style thinking or flavored thinking much, much earlier than that. You mentioned feeling suspicious or paranoid about colleagues. What was that like precisely?
Well, the Iraq War, we didn't know how long we were going to be there or what end state looked like. And so our big boss, the 3-star who commanded all of our forces, he said, listen, I don't know when this is going to end. We're going to stay until we leave. And I don't know what the end state's going to look like. And so the Pentagon and everybody was trying to define an end state. But after we did the big attack to Baghdad and, really destroyed the Saddam Hussein regime and it crumbled, a lot of the people that were in that attack thought their mission, their job was over. We dislodged Saddam Hussein, time for us to go home. And I told people, look, it's not over, because now there's guerrilla warfare, there's terrorists, and this is going to continue until the National Command Authority says it's over and we get to go home. Meanwhile, new units were starting to flow in from the States and allied forces. And so there was a lot of discontent and backbiting and, grumbling and bad talk that we should be going home. We did our part. We took Saddam Hussein down. Our leaders aren't sticking up for us. Colonel Martin is not, he's not fighting hard enough for us. It wouldn't matter what I said anyway, because we weren't going anywhere. But I started hearing these rumblings and I started getting reports, and a number of people started getting really surly and belligerent inside of my headquarters. And so there was enough reality that then my paranoia and my delusional thinking started to take over. So what might have been just a comment, I expanded into a conspiracy. Maybe just, some grumbling that, we should be able to go home and we shouldn't have to stay anymore. I took as, there's going to be a mutiny. My unit's going to rebel against us. Or like in Vietnam, how there were fraggings and assassinations of leaders. And so my mind started playing games with me. And so those were the kind of psychotic, delusional thinking that started to swirl around in my brain.
So there was those early signs of psychosis and sort of like an amplification of things that was happening, and but an overemphasis on that. What then happened until the point where you had to stop work in the army? Just tell me a little bit more about the in between time there.
Sure. We came home from Iraq after a year and went back to Germany, which was our home base. And I crashed badly into depression. I had never experienced anything like that in my life. I mean, I had, no energy. I could barely get out of bed. I was indecisive, withdrawn, didn't want to do anything. But the structure and the mission of the Army made me get up and keep going, which was a real, a plus. But when we redeployed, there's a initial health screening. And one of the things they're trying to do is find out how soldiers are doing mentally. Like, would they have PTSD? Are they suicidal? Do they have depression? And I told the doctors, I have depression. I've never been depressed in my life, as far as I know, but I have it now. And they said, well, what do you do to take care of your depression? And I said, well, I try to do vigorous exercise and get my blood going. I rehearse these power verses from the Bible that say, be strong, be courageous, fear not. And that would help my kind of spiritual thinking. And then I would listen to really intense rock music that would lift my spirits. So I'd like blast this, tremendous music. And then finally at night after work, I started drinking more and more as an attempt to self-medicate. So I was depressed for 10 months. And I finally just pulled out of it. Amazingly, just the structure. My psychiatrist thinks it was just the structure of Army life, having to get up and do my job every day, that suddenly, poof, it went away. And my brain chemistry just kind of on its own went back into some normal type of functioning. I didn't take any medication, no therapy, but suddenly I felt good. And my hyperthymic personality came back again, which then turned into mania. And then the real mania started about a year after Iraq. And it was a combination. So I started getting higher and higher, more erratic thinking, started getting hallucinations, started having more delusions. My decision-making became more suspect. I became more impatient, putting greater and greater demands on my workforce to change and transform faster. And when I would put pressure on to transform, which was what the mandate from my higher headquarters was, the Pentagon, people began naturally to resist because, nobody wants to change, especially, and I was in institutional jobs as opposed to troop combat jobs. Mm-hmm. And so it's one thing when you're with a bunch of soldiers and sergeants and officers and you have a plan and you say, hey, we're going to do this plan. Then everybody's like, yes, sir. And off we go. But when you're in charge of like a school or a university or, a big installation that does training and equipping, and they're not troops, they're mostly civilians. They're not so quick to change, and they learn how to play guerrilla warfare against you. And I knew that's what was happening, but it's hard to go against. And what that did is it raised my stress level tremendously. So I had stress from locking horns with, what was largely a bureaucratic civilian workforce. I had stress coming down from my 4-star generals who were telling me, change, faster, transform. Oh, by the way, here's another budget cut, and that'll make you go even faster. And then we had more and more soldiers coming home from the war, missing, limbs, dead, and so I started being put on funeral duty to go to the hometown funerals of these troops who had been killed in the war. And I always went to the hospital to visit the wounded troops. And that, I think, took a really heavy toll on me that, am I and the Army and my organization, are we doing enough to protect these troops, to give them all the equipment and the technology and the training they need to stay safe, keep their limbs, keep their life? And that took a really big toll. And it just started tearing me apart, that in the political decisions to go into Iraq, and then how once we were there, terrible decisions politically were made that made Iraq go from bad to worse. And all of that stuff just fueled my mania. And so my mania, which was already very high, then started getting into anger and rage and frustration. It was really a toxic witch's brew.
But you still don't have a diagnosis at this point, right?
Right.
So how did that actually happen? Because it sounds to me, when you just give that rich description, that things were getting pretty obvious by that point. At least I would have thought that other people were starting to flag that, your mood was elevating into that state. So, what was happening around you at that time in terms of getting a diagnosis of bipolar disorder?
So it was my bipolar disorder, which was real and going on for this whole 12-year period. It was unknown, undetected, unrecognized. The people around me were untrained and uneducated on what the symptoms of bipolar disorder looked like. So even though they were with a guy who had pretty serious mania, they didn't know what it was. They didn't see it. A couple people did come and talk to me and say, "Hey, are you okay? Are you getting enough sleep? Your behavior and your thinking and the things you're saying seem out of whack." And so a couple people did, try to sort of check up on me, but it was done very mildly. The second big thing was that I was a high performer. I kept getting promoted, kept getting put in higher, bigger, more prestigious jobs. So people thought, well, he's kind of eccentric. He seems overly enthusiastic and energetic, but he's obviously doing a good job, or the Army wouldn't keep promoting him. But that's the thing, is that high performance can easily mask bipolar disorder, especially the more, until you go into full-blown mania or terrible depression, it can kind of mask it. The third thing was that people liked me. One of the things that would happen is I went more manic. My personality grew, so I became more dynamic. People thought I was, really funny. They liked to be on my team because we were doing big, important things. And, who doesn't want to be on a winning team? And so that was a big part of it. And they didn't want to hurt me. So because they liked me, they were afraid that if I got into the mental health system, that I would be hurt, maybe fired, forced to retire. And so those were kind of the factors that led people to not recognize or do anything about my condition until 2014 with the full-blown acute mania, where I was just out of control and, beyond the pale. And then they did start doing something about it.
And how did that play out in terms of getting a diagnosis at that point and getting some support for what you were going through?
Well, the way it played out was they did articles in key newspaper and online journals saying that I was crazy and doing a terrible job. But the 4-star generals in the Pentagon, they basically read those and said, Greg, don't worry about it. These same reporters have attacked us and they're full of baloney. So don't worry about it. No, just forget it. So that was one big attempt that my workforce tried to, get some recognition of my problem. But then as it got worse and worse, they started putting in what were dozens, maybe hundreds of anonymous complaints and reports detailing, how bad I was. And they're just the classic DSM-5 symptoms for bipolar disorder, for mania. And so once these started hitting, then my boss, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who had known me for a long time and really liked me, and we had worked together, had a great relationship. He had handpicked me for the job. Then he said, whoa, this is really bad. We need to do some assessments on National Defense University and on Greg, and we need to do some investigations. And so they did. And what the investigations and assessments found was that I had, really lost it. I'd lost the confidence and the support of the workforce. I was making, very suspect decisions. I lacked self-control, all these classic mania symptoms. Mm-hmm. And once he had the whole picture, he called me in and said, hey, resign or you're fired. And I'm ordering you to get psychiatric evaluation. And I should have been diagnosed properly at that time. But the doctors didn't talk to my military chain of command and vice versa. So that, even though I was intensely manic, I could still have a perfectly reasonable, logical, fluid conversation with the doctors. And so the doctors, one of them actually put down, the chief of psychiatry at Walter Reed said, this is the most emotionally stable general I've ever met in my career. So, and it wasn't like I was trying to fool them or anything. I didn't know there was anything wrong because I felt great. And so they misdiagnosed me in 3 separate evaluations. And so I then saw, my delusions that the workforce was out to get me. Now I had proof that my workforce was out to get me because I knew they were out to get me and get me fired. I got fired. I got forced to retire. And then the doctors 3 times said, there's nothing wrong with you. Well, that was proof that they were out to get me. And then I started spinning into, anger, agitation, rage. And then I crashed into depression. And then once the doctors kind of saw the depression, how much I had changed from when I was manic, then they connected the dots. And it didn't take a rocket scientist where they'd like, oh, this guy has bipolar disorder and he's psychotic. And so then they got the right diagnosis and started to treat me.
And did that come hand in hand with the right treatments for you in terms of medications at that point?
No, it took about 2 more years to get the right medication. So they started treating me with a whole bunch of different medications, and all they did was make me sleepy. And it was mostly antipsychotics that just literally just put me to sleep. And it had no effect on my depression at all, 0. In fact, I kept getting more and more depressed. My psychosis kept getting worse and worse. And then it was about 2 years of what I call bipolar hell that finally I got inpatient a year and a half later and, tried ECT, tried more medication, therapy. And then about 6 months after my inpatient, they prescribed lithium, and that was the silver bullet. So the total period from diagnosis to the correct medication that actually made a difference was 2 years.
Mm. Goodness, that's such a big story and journey, Greg, and such a long one as well. I wonder, so where does that leave you in terms of, it sounds like there was some times, if you look back at them, that, times where you may have been ashamed of you or embarrassed by things that you did. And I'm just wondering, how have you settled in terms of being compassionate to yourself as a result of of those experiences. And how did you have to, rebuild any relationships with people as part of that?
Yes, I would say, I went back and, did my best to rebuild, apologize for having bipolar disorder, which makes no sense because it's a physical disease that you just get. But I did because, I would say, hey, I didn't mean to be so crazy. I didn't mean to upset you. I didn't mean to hurt you, but I had bipolar disorder. And so that's what did it. And so I'm sorry I got bipolar disorder, but it is a physical disease of the brain. So, there's really nothing for me to apologize for. And, but I am anyway. And so I did that with work colleagues, many of whom still don't talk to me, won't answer emails, phone call, because it was for them too painful. And they don't understand the nature of bipolar disorder. With my own family, with Maggie, kids, my mother before she passed away, she had a really hard time with it because she didn't understand it, even though I explained to her many, many times. I think near the end, she finally started to understand what it was. And, when she saw me in the depressed, psychotic state, I think she then acknowledged that this is physically real in the brain. So that was good. And then some of my other friends, most of my friends have been really good about, not holding anything against me. In fact, they're really positive and they applaud, my efforts, my mission to share my story. And then as far as myself, it was, when I finally got diagnosed in November of 2014, I was so happy. I hugged the doctor. I said, thank you, doctor, because I've known that there's something wrong with me, but I didn't know what it was. And I got these evaluations that said I was fine, and I'm not fine. So thank you. Now I want to get better. And so I guess I'm fortunate that I never really felt much of a stigma, if any, because I realized, and I learned a lot about bipolar disorder from our two sons who have it. And, so I understood this is physical, like diabetes or cancer. And so I'm not going to beat myself up for it. I'm thankful that I have a diagnosis and that there's medical professionals that can help me, recover. And, but I really did lose hope and faith when it was 2 full years of hell with, no recovery in sight until lithium. So that was a little bit rough. Mm-hmm. But I think I've been pretty kind and patient, on myself during this whole thing.
And am I right in understanding that your sons received a diagnosis of bipolar disorder before you did?
Yes.
Yeah. And that in itself is an interesting piece as well.
Yeah. So they were teenagers and I was in my 40s and, here I had either just below bipolar or I was actually into a bipolar level. And so I'm dealing with two sons who have bipolar disorder, are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and are trying to, put together their shattered life. And I myself have bipolar disorder, but don't know it.
So interesting. Let's put you in a time machine, Greg. Let's put you back in a time machine, and we're going to give you the opportunity to talk to one of those medical doctors in the army. Let's go back to the one where, remember you said you were going to your medical doctor and saying, I'm depressed and this is what I'm doing. I'm doing exercise. I'm doing my scripture. I'm doing all of this self-management stuff. Then you were drinking, doing everything that you could do that was in your control to manage your depression. And it sounded to me like none of the psychiatrists was like, well, we could try a medication here. Even although you were putting it on the table very clearly for them. we'll stick you in that time machine and we'll put you back in that office with that medical doctor. What message would you want to give them at this point?
I would tell them that, look, I just went through a very intense, stressful, euphoric experience. I felt high as a kite in Iraq, in before Iraq. I was incredibly euphoric, even manic. And, I came out of that and I've crashed. And what they would say is, oh, that's just normal because you just came home from a war. But is it normal to have been so high, which was, we now know, mania, and then to crash so low when I've, never been depressed before? Isn't there more to it? Why wouldn't you consider the possibility of bipolar disorder?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what I would say to them. And then when the depression just didn't go away, instead of kind of waving it off, I would have a conversation and say, hey, this is really serious. I've never been like this in my whole life. And, just months ago, I was high as a kite. I thought I was Superman. I thought I could fly. I didn't need any sleep. I could make rapid decisions. I was pretty much fearless in combat under fire. And I think I would have, if I knew then what I know now, I would have had a much sharper, more pointed conversation about the possibility that I had bipolar disorder.
And to put the shoe on the other foot, it sounds like they could have asked you deeper questions, or asked you questions about, what are you like when you're your usual self? Is it regular for you to feel depression? Is there the chance that this isn't explained just by your environment and, your work situation and the stresses and being deployed at that point? And some more pointed questions about you as an individual and your usual mood states, and how much these mood states were differing for you from your regular self might have helped with that diagnostic process at that point.
Absolutely. Because until that 10-month depression after Iraq, I had been almost my whole life since teenagers completely up, positive, optimistic, driven, energy, like the nicknames I had were like the Energizer Bunny or Martino the Madman, where people thought that I was kind of just always up, because I was always up. And so if he or she had that conversation, I think it could have pointed drastically to how out of character this lengthy depression was.
Yeah. And if that's not, go on, sorry.
One of the things, though, and it happened when I went, when I was getting looked at in Washington, D.C., they don't expect to see it in a senior officer. So, but that depression and that initial mania in Iraq, and then afterwards, I was a colonel. That's very high. It's below general, but colonel's pretty high rank. And they're not used to seeing colonels and generals with bipolar disorder. They're used to seeing 18 to 25-year-old privates, sergeants,
Mm-hmm.
young officers, and it just kind of is out of their norm, and they don't want to hurt you. They're afraid that if they diagnose you with a mental illness, you'll get hurt, you'll get labeled, stigmatized, and it could cost you your career.
Mm-hmm. So a form of protection, but not one that's very, very helpful at that point, and a form of positive bias to, more senior workforce members, being somehow insulated from mental health challenges in a way.
Right.
When
Right.
the opposite is probably true. There's even more layering of stress and pressure in those
Yes.
in those types of jobs, potentially. If your time machine was taking you back to you at your darkest time, Greg, when things were most rough in terms of risk of self-harm or suicide or psychotic thinking behaviors, what would you tell yourself at that darkest time?
I would tell myself what my good friend and battle buddy Bill Barco told me, that you will pull out of this. You can pull out of it. Have hope. Even though everything seems bleak and dark and hopeless right now, hang in there, keep moving forward. Don't give up. Don't kill yourself. Even though you want to die, don't do it. And you will eventually get better. And he said, my son has bipolar disorder and he pulled out of it and he's doing well now. And I've known other people as well. So just have hope, keep going.
Thank you. And finally, let's take your time machine over to Maggie, your beloved wife. Is there anything that you would have liked her to know at the beginning of this journey or when things got most hard and most difficult?
I think that, in the book, she writes a piece and she describes her situation as being like a frog in a pot of water that the flame is turned on. And slowly the pot of water gets warmer and then hot and then very hot. And then it's boiling. And she didn't notice that it was getting hotter until it was boiling. Because when she met me, I had hyperthymia, just this mild mania. And I think that was one of the things she liked about me because I was fun, happy, and energetic, and it was just great. And so my hyperthymia just inched up for years. And then it became, low-level mania. Then it became real mania. Then it became full-blown mania. I think I would say if you start noticing strange, out of character behavior, talk to me, talk to others, encourage me to go in and get a psych eval. But she would say, I tried that, but you didn't listen. I tried that, and then you thought I was the enemy against you. And so you didn't believe me when I saw things. And then the other thing she would say is, I didn't really notice it until the very end. So she noticed that I had really lost it about the time lots of other people did and started sending the anonymous complaints to the chairman. That was about the time she did. And by that time, it was game over. It was just a matter of time before I was going to get fired.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really interesting. Thank you. Okay, so we started out this conversation talking about, some years ago, what was your life like as a new Army recruit and an average day of Greg? Tell me, what's an average day in Greg's life like at this point in your life?
No, my life is terrific. I generally get up pretty early, like 6:00, and I go to the gym and do group fitness classes, do some aerobics, lift weights. And then 3 days a week, I'm also in a group dancing class with some of my friends. And that's a lot of fun, just fun music, fun dancing, energetic, happy people. Then I come home, I eat lunch, and then I go right into my bipolar work. So I'm writing, speaking, coordinating with people, lining up talks and visits. And I've gotten a bunch of invitations since Chicago to give talks at various places, to do grand rounds at different med schools and hospitals. I talk to people on the phone. I do Zooms. So that consumes my whole afternoon into the early evening, like say 6:00. I also try to take a fitness nap for at least 30 minutes every day because I think that's really healthy for me to lie down, close my eyes, try to, hopefully fall asleep. And that's really good. And then about 6:00, I wrap up my bipolar work and then try to do some yoga and then on my own. And then I try to watch the news. I like the PBS NewsHour. I think they're good. And it's pretty solid material, not extreme one way or the other. And then in the evening, I either watch a movie or one of those cool series on TV that are fun to watch and they're interesting. And I try to have like a date night with Maggie. So, because she really likes these series and movies. And those are things that during my time in the Army, I just didn't have time to do. I was too busy. And then I try to get to bed by, I make the coffee for the next morning, and then I try to get to bed by 10.
Sounds like a good life, Greg.
It is. It's great. And I also do some reading. I'm reading a good book right now. It's on suicide prevention. So most of my work, my thinking and reading and studying and movies. Then last night I watched a movie on bipolar disorder. So I'm really trying to, learn more and go deeper on mental health topics.
And of course, you have your own book coming out. Is it September it comes out in print?
Yes, they're saying the 15th of September it'll actually come out. And so then I'm going to get real busy with, book launch, talks, events, visits, etc. And that'll be a lot of fun.
We'll provide the website links for that in the show notes at the end of this recording. I'm so grateful to you for spending so much time with me to give me such deep insights into your very big journey with bipolar disorder. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and expertise this morning with us, Greg.
Erin, it's absolutely a pleasure and an honor. And I am just so in awe of you and Crest BD, the team and the research center that you've built. So I just hope I don't have to wait another year for the ISPD conference to see you in person so I can give you a hug.
I'll look forward to that, Martino. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Erin.
Goodbye.
Bye.